The global cake industry is worth over $65 billion, and most people can't name more than 5 types of cake. That's not just a gap in dessert knowledge. That's a gap in understanding one of the oldest, most culturally loaded foods in human history. Every cake on this planet tells you something about the people who made it, the ingredients they had access to, the technology available to them, and what they decided was worth celebrating. So buckle up, because we're going through every major cake type on Earth, where it came from, what makes it unique, and why it tastes the way it does. Let's start with the most popular cake in America, chocolate cake. Americans consume somewhere around 700 million pounds of chocolate per year, and a huge chunk of that ends up in cake form. The modern chocolate cake only became possible after the 1860s, when companies figured out how to produce cocoa powder cheaply and at scale. Before that, chocolate was expensive and rare, mostly consumed as a drink. When it finally became affordable, bakers went wild. The classic chocolate layer cake relies on 3 things working in perfect harmony: fat to keep it moist, a chemical leavener like baking soda or baking powder to make it rise, and enough sugar to balance the bitterness of the cocoa. Get any one of those wrong, and you get something that's either dry as cardboard or flat as a pancake. Now here's where it gets interesting. Devil's food cake is not the same as regular chocolate cake, and the difference is actually in the chemistry. Devil's food uses more baking soda, which creates an alkaline environment that reacts with the natural acids in cocoa powder. That reaction deepens the color to near black and produces a flavor that's more intensely chocolatey, almost fudgy. It also creates a slightly looser, more tender crumb. Some recipes add hot coffee, not for the coffee flavor, but because the heat blooms the cocoa and the liquid amplifies the chocolate intensity. The name Devil's Food was a cheeky counterpoint to the white ethereal angel food cake, which we'll get to in a minute. Red velvet cake might be the most misunderstood cake in America. Most people think the color is just food dye, and today, it usually is. But the original red velvet got its reddish tint from a natural chemical reaction. The anthocyanins in natural cocoa powder would turn a brick red when mixed with acidic ingredients like buttermilk and vinegar. When Dutch processed cocoa, which is alkalized and neutral, became standard, that natural reaction disappeared, and bakers started reaching for bottles of red food coloring to recreate the look. The Waldorf Astoria Hotel in New York claims a famous role in its popularization. Though the exact history is disputed, what's not disputed is the flavor. The combination of a small amount of cocoa, the tang of buttermilk, and the richness of cream cheese frosting creates something that's genuinely unlike any other cake. Carrot cake sounds like it shouldn't work. You're putting a vegetable in dessert. But the vegetable is the secret weapon. Grated carrots hold moisture remarkably well, keeping the crumbs soft for days after baking. The carrots also add a subtle sweetness that lets bakers cut back on refined sugar. Historically, carrot cake traces back to medieval Europe, when sugar was scarce and expensive, and carrots, one of the sweetest vegetables available, were used as a substitute sweetener in puddings and cakes. The modern American version typically loads in warm spices like cinnamon, nutmeg, and ginger, adds crushed pineapple or walnuts for texture, and finishes with cream cheese frosting. It's a cake that probably shouldn't be as good as it is. And yet here we are. Cheesecake is one of those cakes that divides people sharply. Is it even a cake? The base is cream cheese, eggs, and sugar. There's often no flour, and the argument about New York style versus Chicago style versus Italian style can get very heated, very fast. Here's the truth. Cheesecake has existed since ancient Greece. Archaeologists found references to a honey and cheese cake served to athletes at the first Olympic Games around 776 BC. The American version, particularly the New York style, is dense, rich, and baked low and slow in a water bath to prevent cracking. The water bath keeps the oven humid so the eggs cook gently without curdling. No baked cheesecake, on the other hand, skips the eggs entirely and sets with gelatin or just the cold temperature of the fridge. Very different animal. Angel food cake is the miracle on the other end of the spectrum. No butter, no egg yolks, just egg whites whipped to stiff peaks, folded with flour and sugar. That mountain of whipped egg whites is what gives angel food its signature airy, cloud-like texture. The bubbles trapped in the foam expand in the oven and create a structure that's more air than cake. Bakers cool it upside down after baking, which sounds bizarre but makes perfect sense. If you flipped it right side up while still warm, the delicate foam structure would collapse under its own weight. Angel food became especially popular in the late 1800s in the American South, partly because recipes would split the eggs between sweets, the whites going into angel food, the yolks into pound cake or custard. Zero waste. Pound cake got its name from the original recipe. 1 pound of butter, 1 pound of sugar, 1 pound of flour, 1 pound of eggs, that's it. No leavening agent. The air beaten into the butter and eggs during mixing is what makes it rise. The result is dense, rich, and buttery. closer to a bread in texture than a fluffy birthday cake. Modern pound cakes often cheat with a little baking powder to get more lift, but purists call that sacrilege. Bundt cake, by the way, is not technically a different cake, it's usually just pound cake or a dense butter cake baked in that distinctive ring mold with the fluted sides. The bundt pan was popularized in America by Nordic ware in the 1950s, and the cake went mainstream after a bundt cake won second place at the 1966 Pillsbury Bake Off, and the company was flooded with calls about where to buy the pan. Germany gave the world Black Forest cake, Schwarzwälder Kirschtorte, one of the most visually dramatic cakes in existence. Layers of chocolate sponge, whipped cream, and sour cherries soaked in Kirschwasser, which is a cherry brandy so potent it has its own protected designation of origin in Germany. To legally call it a Black Forest cake in Germany, it must contain Kirschwasser. American versions typically skip the alcohol or use cherry liqueur. The sour cherries are the backbone. They cut through the richness of the cream and the depth of the chocolate in a way that sweet cherries simply cannot replicate. Tiramisu walks the line between cake and dessert in a way that makes you not care about the distinction. The name means pick-me-up in Italian, a nod to the espresso and marsala wine soaked into the ladyfinger cookies that form the base. No baking required. The mascarpone cream on top is stabilized with egg yolks and sugar, and the whole thing chills in the fridge until it sets. Tiramisu only dates to the 1960s or 1970s, relatively recent for a dessert that feels ancient and classic. The restaurant La Bakerie in Treviso, Italy, is the most widely credited originator, though like red velvet, the true origin is claimed by multiple parties and hotly contested. Opera cake is French pastry at its most precise and unforgiving. Layers of almond sponge soaked in coffee syrup, alternated with coffee buttercream and chocolate ganache, finished with a mirror-smooth chocolate glaze. Every layer has to be exactly the same thickness. Every surface has to be perfectly level. The coffee must be strong enough to flavor the sponge but not so intense it overpowers the chocolate. Created at the Parisian Pâtisserie d'Aloyau in the 1950s, it remains one of the most technically demanding cakes a pastry chef can attempt. The flavor when you get it right, that interplay between bitter coffee, dark chocolate and the nuttiness of the almond sponge is genuinely incredible. Baked Alaska is theater disguised as dessert. A layer of cake topped with a dome of ice cream, covered in meringue, and then torched or briefly baked at extremely high heat. The meringue insulates the ice cream so it doesn't melt. The concept dates back to at least the 1860s. The scientific principle that air is a poor conductor of heat meant that a thick enough layer of meringue could protect frozen ice cream from a hot oven, long enough to brown the outside. It was literally a physics experiment that became a dinner party showpiece. Chiffon cake was invented in 1927 by a Los Angeles insurance salesman named Harry Baker, who kept the recipe secret for 20 years and sold chiffon cakes to Hollywood studios for their restaurant menus. He finally sold the recipe to General Mills in 1947, and they published it in Betty Crocker marketing materials, calling it the first really new cake in 100 years. The secret was vegetable oil instead of solid fat. Oil coats the flour proteins differently than butter, and it stays liquid at room temperature, keeping the crumb tender and moist in a way butter can't quite match. Genoise is the workhorse of French and Italian pastry. A whole egg sponge, eggs and sugar whipped over heat until tripled in volume, then flour folded in with barely any fat. The result is dry enough on its own that it's almost always soaked with a flavored simple syrup before being assembled into a larger cake. It's the base layer inside opera cake, inside charlotte cakes, inside elaborate French entremets. Nobody serves plain genoise and calls it done. It exists to carry other flavors. Lemon drizzle cake is a British institution so beloved that surveys have repeatedly ranked it among the UK's favorite cakes. The base is a simple butter cake, but the defining move is the drizzle, a mixture of lemon juice and sugar poured over the still hot cake so it soaks in and forms a light, crunchy crust on the surface. The sugar partly dissolves into the cake and partly crystallizes on top. That textural contrast between the soft crumb and the crackly top is the whole point. Simple but close to perfect. Tres leches is a Latin American sponge cake soaked in a mixture of 3 milks, evaporated milk, condensed milk, and heavy cream. The sponge has to be open enough in structure to absorb all that liquid without turning to mush. When done right, it's simultaneously one of the moistest and one of the lightest cakes you'll ever eat. Mexico and Nicaragua both claim it as a national dessert. The cake's popularity in the US has exploded alongside the growth of Latin American communities, and it's now a fixture in bakeries and restaurants across the country. The Dobos Torte is a Hungarian masterpiece invented by confectioner József C. Dobos in 1884 and presented at the National General Exhibition of Budapest. 7 thin layers of sponge cake with chocolate buttercream between each one, finished with a thin layer of hard caramel on top that snaps when you cut through it. Dobos famously guarded the recipe, and when he finally released it, he donated it to the Budapest Confectioners Guild so it would be freely available to all Hungarian pastry chefs. The caramel top layer was originally designed to preserve the cake longer without refrigeration. Practical and elegant at the same time. Flourless chocolate cake is what happens when you strip chocolate cake down to its bare essentials: butter, chocolate, eggs, and sugar. No flour means nothing to absorb moisture, nothing to dilute the chocolate, nothing to create a traditional crumb structure. The eggs do everything. They set the cake, lift it slightly, and create a texture that's somewhere between ganache and a baked mousse. Dense, fudgy, intensely flavored. Served at room temperature, it's rich and chewy. Served slightly warm, it's almost liquid in the center. Gluten-free eaters love it. Chocolate lovers won't stop eating it. Mille-feuille, 1,000 layers in French, is layers of flaky puff pastry alternated with pastry cream, topped with a glazed fondant finish in that distinctive pattern. The puff pastry is made through a process called lamination, where butter is folded into the dough repeatedly to create hundreds of distinct layers that steam apart in the oven. It takes serious skill to make real puff pastry from scratch. Every layer has to separate cleanly. Every piece of pastry cream has to be exactly the right consistency so it doesn't squirt out the sides when you cut into it. A structural engineering problem that also happens to taste extraordinary. Baumkuchen translates from German as tree cake, and when you cut a cross-section, you'll immediately see why. Dozens of concentric rings, each representing a separate layer of batter cooked onto a rotating spit. Traditional Baumkuchen is made over an open flame, and the spit rotates slowly while batter is ladled on layer by layer, each one setting before the next is applied. A competition-quality Baumkuchen can have 25 layers or more. It's one of the most time-intensive cakes in the world, and it's deeply embedded in German culture as a gift for special occasions. Battenberg cake is a British classic with a past that reads like a royal soap opera. It was supposedly created to celebrate the 1884 marriage of Prince Louis of Battenberg to Princess Victoria, Queen Victoria's granddaughter. The cake is made from two differently colored sponges, traditionally pink and yellow, arranged in a checkerboard pattern and held together with apricot jam, then wrapped in marzipan. When you cut into it, the checkerboard cross-section is the reveal. As much visual theater as it is dessert, and then there's the Yule log, bûche de Noël in French, one of the great examples of cake as performance art. A sheet of sponge, spread with buttercream or ganache, rolled into a tight log shape, then decorated with bark-like texture, meringue mushrooms, and powdered sugar to look like a snow-dusted piece of firewood sitting on a forest floor. The tradition ties back to the medieval European custom of burning a massive log on Christmas Eve for good luck. When that tradition faded, the cake version stepped in to carry the symbolism, and the whole aesthetic, forward. 22 cakes, every single one with a story behind it, a chemistry behind it, and a culture that decided it was worth preserving. The most fascinating thing about all of this isn't the flavor profiles or the baking techniques. It's that across completely different continents, across thousands of years, without any contact with each other, humans independently figured out that combining grain, fat, sweetener, and heat produces something worth sharing with the people they love. So here's what I want to know from you. Drop it in the comments. Which cake on this list do you think is the most underrated? The one that deserves way more attention than it gets? I'll read every single answer. If you learned something new today, hit the like button and pass this one to a food lover in your life, because cake knowledge is the kind of thing that should be shared. Make sure you're subscribed, because next time we're covering a food history that's even more surprising. One ingredient that changed the entire course of world trade and literally started wars. You will not see it coming.